Time now for Voices of the Future. The show that amplifies the perspectives of the next generation of Republican leaders, young professionals, students, and policymakers who champion the values of limited government, free enterprise, and individual liberty. From grassroots activism to tech-driven policy debates, this program is your front row seat to the ideas shaping a freer, stronger America. Now, your host for Voices of the Future, Ardis Jackson.
Hi, everyone. This is Ardis Jackson with Voices of the Future. I have an interesting topic that I want to talk about today. The topic is going to be about, which is something that's very near and dear to me. It is going to be the First Amendment of the United States Constitution. It is one of the most important and well-known parts of the Bill of Rights. It was ratified in 1791. It protects core freedoms that are essential to a democratic society today. And I wanted to talk about this amendment because in this day and age, we're seeing a test of that being trampled from all directions. It is one of the most, and I feel it's one of the most important foundations that we have for a democratic society. And obviously in the wake of Charlie Kirk's assassination, the assassination attempt on Donald Trump, we have had people trying to intimidate people into not expressing their First Amendment rights. And I think we as a people need to come back to understanding what the First Amendment is and become staunch defenders and continue to be staunch defenders of the First Amendment. And we also need to act out the First Amendment and make sure that we check our government at any time or anyone in our government who tries to trample on that right. I was going to give a little historical context to the First Amendment. I'll start off by first reading it in its original writing as it appears on the Constitution. Congress shall make no law respecting an establishment of religion or prohibiting the free exercise thereof or abridging the freedom of speech or the press or the right of the people to peacefully to assemble and to petition the government for a redress of grievances. Now, there's a little bit to unpack in that quote, but it is very important none the same. Congress shall make no law respecting an establishment of religion. Obviously, that was in direct response to the British government imposing a government-sponsored religion on people. And obviously, me as a Christian, I don't think that's the right thing to do, because if you're going to practice a religion, especially one like Christianity, one should do that of their own free will, and they should also do it from the heart. And if people are being forced to do that, then it's not going to be authentic anyway. So the founders, especially James Madison, was pushing very hard to make sure that Congress would not establish a government-sponsored or government-ran religion. This was to prevent tyranny as well from being used through the illusion of religion. So basically using religion to restrict people's rights, basically restrict how they express themselves, and using religion as a way to control people. So it is why it's one of the first statements here that was top of mind when they thought of the First Amendment. And then we go to prohibiting the free exercise thereof. So this gets a little bit controversial. I think some people get the wrong interpretation of it. I think a lot of people on the left takes this as, well, there should be no practice of religion in any part of the government whatsoever. And it's not saying that. It's basically saying that the government should not establish an official religion and force people to abide by that. And so abridging the freedom of speech, that is important because oftentimes democracy, the whole way that the Constitution came about in the first place was through speech. The delegation that met with the First Continental Congress, the whole context of that meeting was to express the ideals and to use speech to come up with a Declaration of Independence. And so if we restrict freedom of speech, then we also restrict the flow of ideals, which contribute to the uplifting of our society. So that is why that is also very important, that we continue to protect the freedom of speech. It is also listed here that, or of the press. So this is why the press has, special privileges when it comes to being able to have that direct line to the government, and it's all for accountability. So the press is there to act as a check to the government and making sure that the government is held to the account of the people and that they're not abusing their position and that what they're doing is known to the American people. So we also want to make sure that the press has its freedom to do its job. Unfortunately, in this day and age, a lot of them, especially the mainstream press, has become very corrupted, and they have an agenda, and it's not really to hold the government in full accountable, regardless of party, but it's basically just to, make one side that they disagree with look bad in front of the American people while protecting and uplifting the person that agrees with their viewpoints. But nonetheless, freedom of the press is something that is vital for a functioning society to thrive. So we must continue to protect that right as well, or the right of the people peaceably to assemble. So we see this playing out before our eyes with people with the No Kings protest, expressing their grievances with the Trump administration, which is quite ironic because the same people who are pushing this, wanting to push the First Amendment to protect their right to express their displeasure with the Trump administration, a person from that viewpoint is the same person who assassinated Charlie Kirk for expressing his political belief and his exercising his right to peaceably to assemble, and just express ideals. So, but this is another way for the people to have a check on the government and making sure that the government that they know where they fall in line with the people. If they're doing a good job by the people will express praise. If they're not, they will express displeasure. Again, this is needed for a functioning society so that ideals can be traded back and forth and to help the government improve on itself. And for redress of grievances. Now, I will say that in today's society, what's being lost is that it said peaceably to assemble. This does not apply to people or groups when they are throwing rocks, throwing Molotov cocktails at government agents, pushing on officers, or physically trying to obstruct officers who are exercising or enforcing laws from doing their duty. So this does not protect those type of protests. And a lot of people today don't seem to understand that the First Amendment protects people to peacefully protest. but some people don't seem to know how to do that, and they still want their right of freedom of speech to be protected while exercising a protest that leads to violence or chaos. And so the other important factor of the First Amendment is the freedom of religion. The Establishment Clause says that the government cannot establish an official religion or favor one religion over another. So this goes back to my earlier point that the government cannot establish an official religion and cannot force people to abide by this religion. They also cannot favor one religion over the other. So it's pretty cut and dry on what that means. The Free Exercise Clause, people have the right to practice or not practice any religion freely as long as it doesn't violate public laws or harm others. So the First Amendment is very clear that people get to express themselves regardless if the opposing group of people or the government doesn't like it or not. And so this grants any right to anyone to do this as long as, again, as it doesn't violate laws and it doesn't harm others. So we have to make sure that people understand that the First Amendment protects your right to protest, but to protest peacefully. And so it also goes on to list that the First Amendment protects individuals' rights to express their opinions and ideas without government interference. We have seen some intrusions on that in as of late, where we have people getting arrested for just filming what's going on. And of course, that's a violation of the First Amendment. And so this also is very important because there's multiple ways for one to express themselves. And so there's a debate on which expression the First Amendment applies to. But generally, most people conclude that the First Amendment protects political speech, symbolic acts like flag burning, as unfortunate that is, art and protest. However, it does not protect certain types of speech like threats, defamation, incitement to violence, or obscenity. So while I, as one who is very pro First Amendment, even I know that there has to be some guardrails and that you have the right to express yourself, but you cannot express yourself in a way that brings harm to others. And you also can't use your expression to violate laws and cause disorder to our societies. So, this is something that has been tried in court. This is something that is an ongoing feud today. But nonetheless, we know that there are some guardrails and that if you are making threats against people, that can warrant a investigation by the government. And that can, if there's evidence that support that the person is trying to bring harm or behind that threat, it can lead to that person's arrest. I have seen in some instances where there are local cities that will try to punish people for expressing something on their property. And if it causes too much of a disorder with people just not liking what the person is displaying, then the city will try to force that person to take that down or to remove it, which in my opinion is a violation of the First Amendment, because to me, as long as that display of art is not harming people or it's not leading to the mental harm of a person. For an example, pornographic material should not be displayed because we do not want children having to see something like that. So obviously there's guardrails, but for the most part, as long as the expression is not directly harming someone, the First Amendment should protect that. But again, there are guardrails. And so the First Amendment we went over the freedom of assembly, the right to petition. And so the reason why the First Amendment is so important is because the First Amendment is the cornerstone of American democracy. It guarantees the ability to speak out against government actions, share ideals freely, practice or not practice religion, participate in civic life, the core principles that distinguish the U.S. from authoritarian systems. So the First Amendment is the bedrock of democracy in America, in my opinion. And when you hear people saying democracy is under threat, democracy will be under threat when the First Amendment no longer applies. When the First Amendment is no longer recognized to be enforced, then we will have no longer a democracy. But I will say that the historical context of where the First Amendment originated from, it was the colonial experience under British rule. Before the American Revolution, the American colonies lived under British law, where freedom of speech, religion, and the press were often limited. So basically the First Amendment, again, was a counter to that. It was born out of that experience. The founding fathers knew that they could not have a functioning government if the government was going to be able to chill people's ability to express themselves. It also knew that speech and press was often censored. Any press or anything that criticized the king or the government could land someone in jail. And this is something that the founding fathers, again, did not want, because our leaders needed to be criticized so that they can know that they need to improve and that they can better themselves. And it makes democracy work when people in charge know if what they're doing is helping the people or not. They also knew that there was religious prosecution, that this was common. Some colonies had established churches. People could be punished or, basically kicked out of their communities for practicing a different faith. And this was not something that the founding fathers wanted. And so they wanted to protect people's right to express the religion they choose. Public protest or assembly was often restricted by British troops or colonial governors. And we see an example of this when the protests around the Tea Act, I believe it was, the Stamp Act, the different rules that the British government was bringing down on American colonies, and them just expressing their displeasure was met with a lot of times brutal force by the British troops, which led to the revolution in the first place. So these abuses left a strong impression on the founders, who wanted to make sure the new government couldn't repeat them. So then we're going to talk about the U.S. Constitution and the demand for a Bill of Rights. The Constitution was written in 1787. It did not originally include a Bill of Rights. Of course, this alarmed many Americans, especially the anti-federalists, who feared that a powerful federal government might trample individual freedoms, much like Britain had. Key figures like Thomas Jefferson, although he was in France at the time, and George Mason argued that a constitution without explicit rights and protections was incomplete. Federalists like James Madison and Alexander Hamilton, they originally argued that the Constitution already limited government power enough, but public pressure grew too strong to ignore. So when that happened, then they knew that the Constitution and its convention was at risk of falling apart. So James Madison stepped in 1789, helped draft the Constitution. He introduced a series of amendments in the first Congress so he could satisfy calls for greater protection of personal liberties. Madison originally drew ideals from the Virginian Declaration of Rights from 1776, which was written by George Mason. State constitution like those of Massachusetts and Pennsylvania had already had protections for speech and religion. Congress then debated Madison's proposal through 1789. The goal was to limit only the federal government, not the states at that time, from infringing on these freedoms. By 1789, on September 25th, however, Congress had approved 12 amendments, which were then sent to the states for ratification. By December 15, 1791, 10 of them were ratified, becoming the Bill of Rights. The First Amendment was the very first of these 10 protections. Now, an interesting fact I will say is that the First Amendment, although it's now recognized as the First Amendment, originally it was not the First Amendment to be considered at that time. The First Amendment actually was stirred behind congressional representation and pay. But when those two weren't ratified, Madison's amendment protecting religion and speech and press became Amendment number 1 and has held that spot ever since. So I will say, kind of wrapping up, that in conclusion, the impact of the First Amendment sets a revolutionary precedent. There's no doubt about that. For the first time in history, a national government formally protected freedom of conscience and expression, not as a privilege granted by rulers, but as natural rights belonging to all people. Over time, the Supreme Court expanded its applications, especially after the 14th Amendment, made the Bill of Rights applicable to the states as well, which was very important because we needed that harmony between state and federal to make sure that people's rights was respected on all levels of government. This is why I can call upon my listeners to always be on the lookout and implore that no matter what level of government it is, whether it be county or city or state, or federal, we must make sure that we voice and stand strong when any government tries to intrude on our First Amendment rights. And so I would say that the First Amendment is obviously the First Amendment, but it is also very important to not only America, but it's also been, paramount to other countries as well. We've seen some limited forms of it in Europe and other places as well, but here in America, that has stood the test of time for 230 years now. It is important because the principles it protects, free speech, press, religion, assembly, and petition, are still at the center of national debates today, which we see happening. And so I will just close by just giving a few examples of how it's being tested as of today in 2025, starting basically around 2020. First, we had with new technology, we had the First Amendment being tested with social media and free speech online. Platforms like X, which was Twitter, Facebook, YouTube, and TikTok have become modern places of public squares. The attention, these are private companies, though, not the government, so they're not bound by the First Amendment in the same way. So this was something I actually learned a few years ago. I was always like, First Amendment. Companies can't restrict speech. But then, doing some more constitutional studies, I realized that the Constitution was geared towards the government. Because the difference between the government and the private sector is that you could jump off Facebook. You could delete your profile off Facebook. They can delete your profile off Instagram or whatever, but you still have options. There's still the opportunity that the person who don't like their speech being restricted on these platforms can create another platform like Trump did with Truth Social. So we see that, the private sector isn't as much of a direct threat. It does have some influences, but it's not a direct threat to freedom of speech like the government, which has the power to force a person to do its will if there's no checks and balances. It has the power of the military, and so it has more force behind it. So that's why the Constitution is geared towards the government. Courts are now wrestling with state laws like in Texas and Florida, where platforms have to moderate their content to appease the state. These are some cases that are before the U.S. Supreme Court now. So in closing, I will just say that the First Amendment is very important. I love the First Amendment. I'm a big proponent of the First Amendment. I'm also a big proponent of it, even if it's people I don't agree with. And that's something we have to always remember, that even if we don't agree with what another person is saying, we still have to defend their right to express it, because it's very important that we cherish that legal protection that we have, and that it continues to be the beacon for the United States and the world as a whole. So I am honored that I got to present this little tidbit of the First Amendment to you guys today. And I look forward to, in the next podcast episodes, I will be discussing more of the amendments of our Constitution, because our Constitution is important now more than ever. My name is Ardis Jackson. I am your host for Voices of the Future. Thank you for listening to my podcast, and have a blessed day.
You've been listening to Voices of the Future with Ardis Jackson, a presentation of the Silicon Valley Young Republicans. For comments and suggestions, or to get involved, email svyr.gop@gmail.com. That's svyr.gop@gmail.com.